Hi everybody, this is Warren Herman. Recently, I've been making some videos about the way in which some different factors can come together to create a new and legitimate path to holiness, among the laity especially, post-Vatican II. The crux of what I'm talking about in these recent videos, there's two of them, is the fact that one of the major reasons for the primacy of the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience is that they moderate the nature of attachment, and that attachment often triggers all of our unconscious reactions. And if our unconscious reactions are triggered too much, then there's too much material to process, and we don't have the adequate skills to deal with it. However, I've been making the case that throughout time, the Church's mission involves the redemption and integration of various coping techniques that come from other philosophies, therapies, and even religions in a sense, that what is authentically human in all different human movements is redeemed, reintegrated, and elevated into the Catholic synthesis. We see this as a standard thing that has happened throughout history, even among the apparitions of Mary, such as Our Lady of Guadalupe, when she takes on the Aztec culture, or even in our respected theologian like St. Thomas Aquinas, who took on Aristotle, redeemed and reformed his content, and synthesized it into the Catholic faith. So the redemption of authentically human methods is not foreign to the Catholic synthesis. In fact, I think it is essential to it, and is the outworking of the incarnation in history. But that being said, I believe we should, in the Church post-Vatican II, this has given us the capacity to redeem the skills, for example, of using attention, intellect, cognition, the will, the heart, and all different other areas. It's given us different skill sets, which have allowed us, or potentially allow us, to when attachment triggers unconscious material, we would have enough coping skills to deal with it now. And so this is not necessarily a prideful thing that we have gained better techniques, but that we have integrated lower techniques more effectively. And so, because the thing is, these techniques are not superior to those of our Catholic tradition, because the Catholic traditional techniques of prayer and virtue and so on and so forth, and sacraments are more advanced than the techniques we're using now. But it's that we have added these lower techniques, that these have now allowed us to do other things if we are in other contexts. So this is the premise I've been making in a more clear way in other videos. And so it's this sense of redeeming things like the ability to pay attention, which we get from the mindfulness therapies, or the ability to question thought, which we get from the cognitive therapies or Stoicism, the ability to use different techniques of surrender and behavioral reform from the AA and different things like that. There's all these things we kind of redeem out of different traditions. And that helps us process unconscious material. That's what it helps us to do. So what I'm really trying to do here is explain something about more of the context in which this happens historically. And one of the things that I want to do to kind of draw out this context is actually to quote from Lord of the Rings. I don't have the book in front of me, but I'm going to describe the scene, and those of you who are familiar with the book will understand this scene very well. Those of you who are familiar only with the movies will not recognize this scene because it's kind of cut, because it's a hard thing, I'm sure, to film. And this is the scene where Saruman, who is originally the head of the White Council of Wizards, reveals that he has become a traitor. And he reveals himself not to be Saruman the White any longer, but to be Saruman of many colors. In his speech, he gives Gandalf some interesting comments, and one of them is that he says, white serves as a beginning. Like white light can be broken. A white page can be dyed, with different colors on it. So it's like he gives this way of talking about his transformation from Saruman the White to this broken Saruman of many colors. And this is essentially what goes wrong as revolution occurs. There are different books today that propose in a positive way the structure of revolution as follows. They propose like a triangle, that the early church and society was like a triangle, a hierarchy. Then there was an attempt at revolution to switch the level of the hierarchy, but that didn't work. What we really need is a kind of emergence, a kind of evolution of culture that's kind of round and nonlinear and networky. So it's this switch from hierarchy to revolution to like a network or an interconnected thing that is proposed as the pathway to social transformation. Just like we heard, and this is very much, I think, in line though with Saruman's comments that it breaks. You want to break the white thing to get the multicolored thing. It's kind of this sense of we are breaking with tradition. Now, the thing that's interesting here is it shows us very clearly, because if you see the hierarchy is stable, the old way of Christendom was stable. Revolution was never stable because you can't, and it always falls to its side. That's why communism always topples and becomes hierarchical, because it can't, the way revolution doesn't have the center of gravity to kind of stand like hierarchy does. That's why it always flips around. That's why books like Animal Farm always depict the way, the animals eventually become like the people. And so it's like, that's the way it always goes, because there's this unstable nature of revolution. Now, of course, like the kind of, the network is maybe a little better in some ways. But the thing here is that in the history of the West and the decline of the West, this has always been the problem. It's been the decline from hierarchy to revolution to evolution is always the decline of the West. And of course, so what we need to do though is we need to say, well, what is actually supposed to happen as the West undergoes these changes and as the church accompanies the West through these changes? Is there no value in any of these changes? Do these things propose anything of human use? And what is the appropriate response? We could say that the appropriate response is always a return to hierarchy. And that would be maybe a traditionalist understanding of things. I would say, okay, that the ideal is to go back to hierarchy. Or we could say that it is to go to a revolution. That may be the modernist understanding of things. Like, okay, like we have to try to really actually flip the hierarchy around. And these things are not going to really help us very much. Of course, I think that the strategy, as we've heard, as people have described modernist strategies, this is evolution from this direct attempt to overthrow the church, but then they talk about strategies, and we can debate the details of some of these things, or whether it's profitable to worry about them so much. But it's helpful sometimes to think like, okay, the strategies of infiltration, so to speak, and slow ideological work are more that emergent strategy. They're not as, okay, like we're going to fight things directly. They're more like, okay, we're just going to change things. We're just going to kind of have this emergent shift over time. And so there's definitely that those are some ways of talking about these things that you'll recognize. If you're familiar with thinking about the problems and crises in the church, you'll say, okay, well, the thing is originally we had hierarchy, then we have revolution and opposition, like from the Freemasonry. Then we have more of these strategies of these kind of these ideas about infiltrating things, these ideas about slow emergent change, these type of things. So it goes from hierarchy, revolution, evolution. So what I want to say here, though, is that, again, what is the appropriate response? And the reason why I'm making this video is because I am proposing changes. I'm proposing that change is good. I'm proposing something that to many people might sound a little bit different than a traditional resolution of the crisis in the church. And it's because I'm saying something that isn't exactly a traditional resolution of the crisis of the church, not because it's not rooted in tradition, but because I have a certain sense of what the dynamism of tradition is throughout time and how it works. And it's not to say that I know I have a correct understanding or not. I mean, I believe it's correct, but I want to submit it to you now so you see what it looks like. So I don't believe in this paradigm of change from the hierarchy to the revolution to the evolution. And I think that's the wrong way. That's the decline of the West. What I'm saying, though, is that at times what happens is that there are ways that we can add things on to the hierarchy. So you see, as things kind of become revolutionary in society, all right, you kind of need the laity to kind of move out. You need this kind of ability for the laity to kind of know what's going on, or there's things like that. So there's a way in which the thing is starting to kind of flip, even inside the church. But what we want, I can't do it with my hands, but it's almost like a Star of David type symbol. The church is supposed to have both the hierarchical and the inverted thing unified with each other. We want to kind of, there's going to be a need, for example, to have something that's not exactly as hierarchical, but it needs to be united to the hierarchy. So any changes that we have, so for example, if there's things that seem modernist, for example, or there's things where the laity seem to be becoming too priestified or things like that, that needs to happen in union with the hierarchy. That's the only way you could stabilize it, because then you have both of these triangles, and then it's stable. It doesn't have that problem of revolution where it starts to tip. So there are things where there are good things that come out of revolutionary changes in a sense. So for example, and I'm going to propose these things relatively. So for example, in the Protestant Reformation or Protestant Revolution, depending on how you want to talk about it, if you want to be controversial or not. I'm just trying to, you would talk about this thing where, the people are going to have different abilities. They're going to have a focus on study of scripture, a focus, for example, let's say the Amish, they have a very radical life of humility, a very radical life of simplicity. These are good things. Like reading scripture more and having a simple life more are really good stuff. These are good things to integrate. And Catholic laity could integrate these things. It doesn't mean they're mandatory, but they could be done. Doesn't mean you become Protestant to do it. And that's the problem, is that we don't want to set these things up in opposition to each other. We want to see if there's something that kind of flips the hierarchy. We want to use it in a way in union with the hierarchy, so as to keep the process balanced. And I think the concrete example I think of, like the Amish type lifestyle, for example, would be something really good like that. So the Anabaptists who were living this radical Christian life, that could be a really good thing. It's almost like being in a third order or something like that. It's like, but it doesn't have to be separated from the visible hierarchy. It doesn't need to be set up in opposition to it. And that's the essential thing. I think it's kind of like there's this need for a complementarity rather than an opposition. And I think that is what always has to happen. It's very much like we have to build on the foundation. And this is different than what Saruman was saying. He was saying white serves as a beginning. A white light can be broken, or a white page can be dyed into a different color. I think that this is a very different use of a foundation. This means the foundation remains white. It's almost like you take white light and then you put a gem or a prism, and you use the white light to then shine the light out and just to show all these other colors that are in it. It's not like you're breaking the light. You're not getting rid of the white light. You're expanding it and showing different valences of it and showing different wavelengths in it. It's like you're expressing it in a different, more beautiful way, rather than saying, hey, this is something to be destroyed. So I hope some of these things are starting to communicate some things. So then we want to go to that network type thing, and that kind of emergent type thing. And yeah, like we can still do that. We can have all these networks. You can see, things like, different ways in which communities build today, especially in the traditional movements. You see how like the Latin Mass communities really build community there. You see all these different ways in which the laity are unconsciously organizing themselves or consciously organizing themselves into intentional communities. And this, I think, is something that's very important. I think this is a very important sign of the times, so to speak, not like in a weird way, but like it shows where we are in the process of the decline of the West, that we are in this time where we are moving from a hierarchical church to an inverted church, but we weren't supposed to go there. We were supposed to go to this kind of like upside down and right side up church all at the same time. And then we're moving on to this kind of emergent, and it's got all the elements. Like it transcends and includes all that goes before it. Like it has all these things included in it. And so there's this way in which the hierarchy is the core of the intentional community. The like anything that's inverted is united to the hierarchy anyway. And then it's like all this stuff is holding together. So I do think there's a way in which, for example, there's different movements throughout time. Like there's different phases of history throughout time where you may have different movements in the devotional life of the laity. But I actually think that ultimately what's happening is a real progress which is not which is a rooted and actual dynamism throughout time that shows a pattern throughout time that is part of the resolution of history to some degree. I don't know if we're in the end times, so to speak. Everyone always, we are always certainly in the end times because we are in the church age. But the thing is that the the thing is like it does. I don't know if this is the final. I don't think this is exactly the final loop in the thing, but I think that there is definitely a way in which we want to understand this pattern, which could be used improperly throughout history. Of okay, hierarchy, revolution, evolution. We want to understand that each one we have to tack them all together to see the Catholic pattern, which it's not. It's none of this opposition or phases. It's more like it's like they're all working together, and so I think that ultimately what I'm getting at is when I propose things like when I talk about how there's a new call to holiness in the lay state, for example, post Vatican II, because of the redemption of different coping skills and things like that. What I am saying is something that there is something new, but I'm saying that it's a new step in the same pattern of the incarnation that's been happening throughout history in the redemption and evangelization of culture. And so I'm talking about the same process of Christ taking on flesh or Mary taking on the cultural clothing in her apparitions. I'm talking about that same process. And I'm talking about it in this way, working out through history. And I'm saying it is different than ways things have been in the previous periods, but that there could definitely be echoes of, of these type of movements in other periods, such as the Third Orders. There's different types of piety that people may have had in different time periods that may have shown these things. But I do think there's a real progress, a real change, which is rooted in the pattern of the incarnation throughout history and the redemption of culture by the Catholic Church throughout history. So that's maybe an interesting, odd way, maybe not said the best in all the different things, but I hope it conveys at least some of the concepts of what I'm trying to say here about how things are changing throughout the history of the West in light of some of these different things and the nature of the incarnation as it has its effect on human thought.